I'm Bob Wolfson. I was born March 6, 1952 at Emmanuel Hospital in Omaha, Nebraska. The second child of Bernice and Alan Wolfson, the grandson of Ida and Louis Paperny. I lived here most of my childhood until I went away to college. After college I came back, went to law school, and spent 28 years before I moved out of Omaha. So I have a lot of roots in Omaha, and my family is a very, very important part of my strength, of where I come from, of what I'm about. So let me talk about my grandfather. I like to say that I grew up in a kibbutz. My grandfather had 4 daughters, Sylvia, Rose, Ruth, and Bernice. My mom was the youngest of the 4 daughters, and my grandfather was an immigrant, came from Russia, and he badly, badly wanted to have a son. And biology was not a friend, so he had 4 daughters. And by the time he got to my mom, he decided that he was going to live with the fact that he had 4 daughters, but he was going to treat my mom as if she were the son that he always wanted. So my mother became his companion in business, the place that he invested the kind of fatherly, son-like relationship that men at that time looked for. When my mom and her sisters all came of age to get married around World War II, all of them married within probably 6-7 years of each other. My grandfather, in what was probably a pretty unusual thing to do, gave each of the sons-in-laws an equal partnership in his successful grocery business. That was the wedding present. The men got a job, but they didn't get a job because of the woman's interest in the business. They got a job because of my grandfather's generosity, but they were equal partners. The papers were drawn up, and they were all equal partners in the business. And as children, there were 9 of us, grandchildren. As children, our parents and grandparents were in business together. So I like to say that for most weeks, we ate dinner in my family, as a family, all 19 of us, the 9 grandchildren, the 4 daughters of my grandparents, their spouses, and my Bubby and Zadie, all 19 of us ate dinner at least 4 times a week together, at least. That's not counting the fact that the men and my grandfather were in business with each other every day, and that until they died, my aunts and my mom spoke to each other probably 10 times a day. It was an environment where the whole of our family was just integrated with each other in ways that are quite extraordinary and quite different. I like to say that my growing up feels a lot more to me, as I've grown up and begun to put words to it, felt more like to me like a generation before my actual age. I'm a 3rd generation American, but I resonate more with and have more in common with 2nd generation Americans, people whose parents were immigrants. My contemporaries don't have the same sense of family and sort of totalness that our family had. And I think our family was a bit unusual in the intensity with which that played itself out. It had major consequences for all of us, had wonderful consequences, but also had social consequences. Your notion of blood over friends was a huge issue. Your connection with your family was the primary lens by which everything was decided. You could say that your cousin was the biggest bum in the world, but if somebody else were to say something critical about your cousin, you were nuts. Nobody could say bad things about your family. Your family could say bad things about your family, but nobody could touch your family. And that was a very, very important part of our growing up. My Bubby, Ida, was a balabas, a queen of the house, a guardian of the house. She made everything in her house from fresh ingredients. She didn't use anything canned. She had a house. My Zadie bought a house 4 blocks from Louis Market, from the grocery store. And she would call on the phone and say to my grandfather, send this and this and this, and he would send a boy over, and she would get flour, and she would get fresh vegetables, and there would be somebody going back and forth all day long. So my buddy constantly cooked, constantly took care of her garden, constantly was part of creating this Jewish home that was an amazing place for us to grow up in, for us to see. Friday night dinner at her house, all 19 of us, every Friday night, every holiday. She would get up in the morning. The girls would call her at 6 o'clock in the morning and say to her, Mom, do you want us to come over? And she would say, it's all done already. She would wash the floor and put newspapers down, so while she cooked, the stuff would go on the newspaper. She made pickles, she canned, she made jam, she made jelly, she baked, she made homemade kishka and gefilte fish, and you don't know, you just can't imagine. You can't imagine. And it was a small house, and there were a lot of us, and it was crowded, and it was noisy, and the 9 of us kids would go down to the basement and play, and usually someone got hurt, went to the hospital, got cut, got banged up, so the evenings would end at the momentous occasion when someone was overwhelmed by the cousins. It was just an amazing childhood, rich with great stories of the store. The store was like being born into Disneyland. I mean, it was this my grandfather had the bar and the small grocery store, and in the mid-1950s, I was already alive, I don't remember this, but in the mid-1950s, when he was already in his 60s of age, he was in his mid-60s when most people were thinking of retiring, he built what was then the largest grocery store in 5 states. Louis Market was a 17,000 square foot supermarket, and no one had ever heard of a supermarket before. It was the time when grocery stores were small, very intimate places. The AP and Hinky Dinky had stores, but the vast majority of people in Omaha still shopped at small neighborhood grocery stores that had a fresh butcher shop and a very small selection of groceries, bread, milk, and those things. And so in the mid-60s, my grandfather went into debt and built this what is now an overgrown convenience store. But at the time, a 17,000 square foot grocery store in the mid-50s was revolutionary. It was just unbelievable. And he built this place, and it was like being in Disneyland. There was the liquor store at a time when Iowa still restricted its sales of liquor, and people from Iowa would come over. I remember we used to just go through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases of liquor every year, and we had fine wines, and it was this little teeny liquor store that did this incredible volume. It was the highest volume liquor store in the state of Nebraska for years. People would come and buy. Of course, people drank then, and not only did they drink, but they gave liquor as gifts, so people would come and they'd buy 30, 40 cases of liquor for Christmas presents. That was very common, and the volumes of things that we would sell. I mean, today, I'll bet in the Christmas season alone, we probably sold more Chivas Regal in a weekend than they sell Chivas Regal in a whole year in the state of Nebraska now. It was just a different time of life. People drank, people gave gifts, things that are just no longer true anymore. And I remember the truckloads of booze coming in, and they had a conveyor belt that would send it down the basement, and then they'd bring it up, and people would buy 5, 10, 20 cases of this stuff at a time. I remember my first memory of life is being in the bar. My very first memory that I remember is vividly being in the bar. I mean, I literally grew up in a bar. It was this great neighborhood bar where if I walked in today, there would be people sitting at the bar that I've known most of my life. People that are still sitting in the same seats that they've been sitting in for 50 years are still in that bar, in the same seats. So it's this tremendous sense of community, of family, of business, of responsibility for your family and the community in which you live, connectedness. We knew people. People would come and we would take bets on how many dollars of groceries they would have. It was a very Catholic community. People would come in with 12, 15 kids, buy grocery carts full of milk, grocery carts full of bread. I mean, just amazing quantities of food. Of course, in the produce departments, those days, none of the fancy things they have now were true. Even in the meat department today, a lot of the produce comes in, it's already packaged up. And these days, you bought onions in 100-pound bags, you bought potatoes in 100-pound bags, and we had machines that would bag them up in 5-pound bags, and you had to staple them together. And you bought strawberries, and you had to put them in pint containers. They would come in flats and not already packaged. Everything was, lettuce came in a case of lettuce, and you had to trim it and wrap it yourself. This was stuff we did from the time we were kids. I tell friends, I learned how to run a cash register when I was 4. I was selling pumpkins and Christmas trees and bedding plants and bagging groceries. We did all that stuff. It was what most kids learned when they were teenagers, when they had their first jobs. I learned it as an infant. I learned that stuff. It was just part of my existence. And the wealth of characters. Everybody in our neighborhood, everybody in Benson, at one time or another worked at Louis Market. If you were a kid growing up and you were a high school kid, you became a sacker, you worked in the meat department, you worked in the produce department. So our family knew all of these people. And my uncles were a stitch, each of them with great personalities. My aunts, of course, were each of them tremendous personalities of their own. Sylvia and Morton, I mean, I could talk for hours. I mean, it's each of them. Sylvia Morton had Bruce and Nancy. Nancy was the eldest of the cousins. Ben and Rose had Paul and Bill Rosen. Aunt Ruth and Uncle Leonard had Lori and Steve. And my mom and dad had Ronnie and myself and Doug.
Bob, do you remember how your grandfather got started in the business?
Yeah.
After he came to this country.
Yeah. I mean, of course, some of this is legend. I mean, there are great legends about my grandfather. Of course, no one really knows truth from fiction. Many of them are gone, and this technology wasn't available. We weren't smart enough to preserve all of the stories at the time. I kind of sadly wish I could go back to some of those days. Yesterday, my dad and I were sitting with Harry Wolfson. My dad, Doug, and I were with Harry Wolfson, who's the eldest living relative of that time. You got to remember that my grandfather, Louis Paperny, married Ida Wolfson. So all the Wolfsons in Omaha are not my dad's cousins. They're my maternal grandmother's cousins. So my grandmother was one of 7 Wolfsons who came from the same shtetl, and they all came. There was a whole group of them that came from there. Mrs. B came from the same shtetl. What's his name from the Fireside Restaurant? Dan Cohn came from the same shtetl, and my Bubby and Zadie knew each other in the old country, so they came from the same shtetl. The story is that my Bubby and Zadie actually came separately. Actually, the story is it's a wonderful story. I'm not sure how true it is, but it's a wonderful story nonetheless. My Bubby and Zadie, my Zadie was a bit of a personality. He was a large personality, short and stout and very strong-willed and very much a character. My Zadie, according to the story, fell in love with my Bubby in the shtetl that they lived in and asked her to marry him, which of course at the time most marriages were arranged marriages. It would explain something because my Zadie probably didn't go for that, but he asked her to marry him, in the old country, and she refused because the family had already suffered from the Tsarist pogroms and was already planning to come to the United States. Apparently, my Zadie did not know where she was coming to. And she and her 7 brothers and sisters made their way to Omaha, actually through Galveston, Texas. They did not come through Ellis Island, they came through Galveston, and made their way to Omaha, where there were landsmen. There was landsmanschafts. There was these societies of people that came from villages, and they would send each other notes and come here. It's a golden to Medina, and there's jobs, and the Union Pacific, and the packing houses. And if you were, like you said, if you were alive and you came on Saturday and you woke up on Monday morning, you could find a job if you were willing to work. You may not like what you did, but you could find work. Most of them started in the packing houses, as did my Zadie. Started in the packing house, and he realized within a day that was not for him. He was not going to survive being there. We've lost the name of the family that he came to stay with. My Bubby had come 2 years before. My Zadie came 2 years later. Incidentally, my Zadie never spoke of his family after he left Russia. We know that he had family. We have some of the names of the family, but he never spoke of them. And we believe that he left under bad circumstances. He was a strapping young man. They probably did not want to, either could not or did not want to leave him en masse. And he came anyway, and never communicated with his family. And we believe most of them were lost in the Holocaust. We really don't know what happened to them. But my Zadie came over through Ellis Island sometime later, and was living in a room with 10 or 12 guys in Lower East Side. I remember my Zadie probably came in 1914, 1915, in that era, which was the end of the third wave of immigration. And so the Lower East Side of Manhattan was crowded with unemployed Jews from Russia and Poland. It was, people were peddlers, they were trying to make a living, they did whatever they could, and actually HIAS and organizations like that were formed to find jobs in the hinterlands for these Jews. It's how Jews ended up in these places. They ended up in Marshalltown and in Quad Cities and in Kearney and in Grand Island because there were jobs there. They needed business people. The country had only really settled 50 years before. It was, the railroads were there, but there were not enough people to sell dry goods and to be merchants and to be tailors and to do all the things that were necessary. So these Jews and Irish and Polish immigrants were encouraged to come to these small communities. So my grandfather had heard the name Omaha mentioned, and the story goes that he went to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and they spoke Yiddish. My Zadie spoke Russian and Yiddish, knew not a word of English. And then he said to them, there's a place I know there, landsmen, some place called Omaha. And they looked in the atlas, and there was an Omaha, Texas, and an Omaha, Nebraska. And the story goes that he asked how many people there were in each place, and Omaha, Nebraska had more people. And he figured the Jews would go to a place where there were more people, so he didn't go to Omaha, Texas. And he wrote a letter to somebody's name, a name that is now lost in the history. General delivery, Omaha, Nebraska, family, so such and such, and wrote and said, I'm in New York, I don't have any money, I understand there are people from our village in this community, and I'm interested in coming. And they sent him a one-way Union Pacific ticket, and he got on, with no money, got on a train in New York, and came to Omaha. They met him at the train, and they actually let him stay in their apartment and slept on a couch for a period of time. And he got a job at this packing house. That didn't work out. He didn't like that. Apparently, he got a job working for a mortuary, where he helped with gathering the clothing of people that had died and selling it or destroying it or helping clean up after dead people. He didn't like that much either. Eventually, he made his way into what many of them did. He got some money together, and he went to the fruit market, and he bought some fruit, and he became a peddler. And it was already late in the game because he was living in South Omaha, where many Jews were, and eventually found his way out to Benson, which was actually a separate community. He He kind of worked his way. I think he was on L Street for a period of time. He found a corner and set up a fruit stand on the corner, and eventually made his way out to Benson, where he made a fruit stand on the corner of 57th and what became the Radial Highway, and began building his business from there. Now, the best part of the story, and this of course is also apocryphal, the best part of the story is that he did not know my Bobby had made it to Omaha. And he was living here for a period of time, and he was beginning to make money and save money. He was still living with this family. And he decided that he was going to go see something, a new technology, a moving picture show. And he goes to the moving picture show, and he's standing in line, and who should be in front of him but my Bubby and her sister. Had no idea she was in Omaha. So they reacquaint with each other, and the story is told that over the next 2 years, my grandfather, my grandmother, not then his wife, and her sister, who was the supervisor of this paramour thing going on, met every night after work and walked in the park. They didn't have any money. They walked in the park, they had a coffee, they would talk, and the sister finally lost patience and met my Zadie privately and said to him, "Louis, something's wrong." And he said, "What do you mean?" And she said to him, "Do you love my sister Ida?" And my Zadie said, "Yes, I love your sister Ida." And she said, "Is it true that you asked my sister to marry you in Russia?" He said, "Yes, it's true that I asked her to marry me in Russia." She said, "You've been going out with us for 2 years. If you love her and you've been going out for 2 years, why don't you ask her to marry you?" And my Zadie lived to be 83 years old. And what I'm saying to you is the honest to God's truth. It is absolutely a true story. My grandfather's answer to my Bubby's sister was, "I don't believe in asking the same person the same question twice." And in his 83-year life, the only time my Zadie ever asked somebody the same question twice was asking my Bubby to marry him a second time. Never did it. And my Zadie was such a character that you knew when he asked you that if you didn't answer him or you gave him an answer he didn't like, he would just go on. He wouldn't be mad at you. He wouldn't doubt you're telling the truth. He wouldn't question you, but he would never ask you a second time. If he said to you, "Do something," and you didn't do it, he'd just get somebody else to do it. And he had that kind of force of personality that you instinctively understood that when Louis asked you to do something, you did it. You paid attention to his questions. And in his life, he never did it again. Great story. Great story. Great story. My grandfather was a person, I say to people, if you want to know what I want to do when I grow up, I want to be a pimple on my Zadie's butt. That's what I want to do. I want to be a shadow of the person my Zadie was. I would be a quite substantial man if I could be a portion of what my Zadie was. I'll leave the names out. But in the 1930s, although my mother hated me talking about this, my Zadie was among those Jewish grocers that were involved in bootlegging. The reason, the guy who was Peter Blotke, who was the main bootlegger in Omaha and was the one who started United Distillery, right? This is David Friedland's father-in-law, right? If you think of the history of Omaha. Peter Blotke was the main smuggler, the main bootlegger in Omaha. And many of the Jewish grocers were selling liquor under the table. That's how they distributed the booze. And so my Zadie had bananas in the back room, and between the bananas he had bottles of liquor that he would sell during Prohibition. And of course my mother and her sisters say that never happened. It's absolutely true. I have eyewitness testimony. I've talked to people that know that it was true. And it's no mistake that liquor license number 1 in the state of Nebraska, after Prohibition was lifted, was Peter Blotke and United Distillers. They became the first distributors. You can't sell liquor if you don't have a distributor. So liquor license number 1 was Peter Blotke, and liquor license number 2 was Louis Piperny. No mistake. And liquor license number 3, I believe, was Roy Feltman, who was the Budweiser distributor, for forever and ever. And all of them were Jewish guys that knew each other and that were involved in all of this to make money. And the story goes that my Zadie did fairly well during that period of time. It was right after the Depression, and people were drinking, and it was during Prohibition, and so people paid a premium for that, and he was building his business. He had the fruit business and the side liquor business, and he did fairly well. We have a panoramic picture of that period of time with bushels of honeydew melons for 40 cents, whole bushels for 40 cents. And my grandfather always said, it's one of the great lines of my Zadie, he always said, it's always better to make 5 quick nickels than it is 2 slow dimes. So he believed, like Mrs. B, you sell cheap, you give a fair deal, and you make faster money that way. They were all these hustlers that understood the 5 quick nickels is better than 2 slow dimes theory. And my Zadie had a cousin that worked for him. And he discovered that this cousin who was working for him, who will remain unnamed, this cousin was stealing from him, caught him stealing. So my grandfather, who was by then somewhat successful, and I want to remind you, this is the mid-30s. My grandfather went to the Douglas County Bank that was owned by a family, and on a handshake got a $10,000 loan. And he went upstairs to the Five and Dime, and the bank was in an old building, and next door was a Five and Dime, and he went to the Five and Dime and got a valise. He took the $10,000 and he put it in the valise, and he went to the basement of the store, and he called the cousin in, and he sat him down, and he said to him, I want you to take this money. And he opened the valise and he turned it around and he shoved it across the table, $10,000 in cash, which at the time was like a fortune. And the man looked at him and said, what are you talking about? And he said, I want you to do me a favor. He says, here's what I want you to do. So tomorrow morning, you and your brother are going to wake up and you're going to move out of Omaha. You're going to leave Omaha. And you're going to go anywhere you want. And you're a hardworking, smart man. And you're going to take this $10,000 and you're going to invest it in a business. And because you're a hardworking, smart man, you're going to be successful at that business. And you're going to grow the business. And you're going to grow it bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're going to have to hire people. And one day, somebody you've hired who you trust is going to violate your trust. And on that day, I want you to think of me. And my Zadie stood up and walked out of the room, leaving the $10,000. The cousin took the $10,000, went out of Omaha the next morning with his brother, went to a different community and bought a business. And 10 years to the day later, returned and had a suitcase with $100,000 in it and paid back my Zadie with interest and said, and had become very successful, made a fortune, a very successful businessman. And he said to my Zadie, you are the first person in my life that ever treated me like a man. Now, why do I tell you that story? I tell you that story because I became a lawyer and my family was in business and I caught somebody stealing from us. And I sent him to jail. So when I tell you that I want to be a pimple on the tuchus of my Zadie, I mean it. He was an extraordinary man. Now, I was a family member, but he was an extraordinary man. He had a sense of human beings and a sense of what you could do that was beyond description, beyond description. I mean, who takes their sons-in-laws and gives them an equal partnership in the business for their wedding presents so that they can be feeling like independent men? Who does that in 1948? 1946. Who does that? I mean, it was unheard of. Unheard of. He was an extraordinary man. They say of my Bubby was a character. They say of my Bubby that her tongue was so sharp that she could slice you up and you didn't even know you had been sliced. She was a sharp-tongued woman. And her house was her house. Oh my God.
Well, Bob, let's go back and you tell me about your education, starting with elementary school.
Of course, we grew up in Benson. Before elementary school, we grew up in Benson. But we moved to Dundee School. That was moving on up, right? You know, if you had some money, Benson was a great community, was a bedroom community, but was a decidedly blue-collar community. Most people were working on the railroad or plumbers and carpenters and working-class folks. And of course, Benson included the country club area, which was the fancy schmancy. That was, country club was doctors and lawyers. I mean, that was a fancy area. And when my Zadie began to make money, he bought on 56th and Miami, which was more the country club kind of crowd. Never really fit into that crowd, but that's where they lived. So when I was born, I was born and raised the first 4 years we lived in the Benson area, and then we moved to 5019 Cummings, which was a block away from my Aunt Sylvia and Uncle Morton, and was Dundee School area. So we walked to Dundee School from 5019 Cummings. School was, it's actually a story I tell that is very telling of Jewish transitions. Of course, as a child, I understood that my Hebrew name was Yisrael Meir Ben Avram. I knew who I was named for. My father's father had passed away after my older brother was born. Before I was born, I was named after my Zadie on my dad's side. So I knew that my Hebrew name was Yisrael Meir Ben Avram. In my family, I was Bobby, and that's my name. That was my name. I had no clue of anything else. And what was probably a foreteller of my educational career, which was interesting and roller coaster-like. The first day of kindergarten, I remember very well. My mother denies that this ever happened, denied that it happened. The teacher took each student one at a time and interviewed them. She wanted to know if they could read, if they could recognize characters and numbers, if they could count. And then she would give them a cookie and a pea of milk and then a little rug, and you would lay down and take a nap during the day when you were in kindergarten. The teacher was interviewing each of the kids one at a time, and of course my name was Wolfson. And until Aaron Zeiderman came from Israel when I was in 5th grade, I was the end of the alphabet. W was the last. I was the last one. And the teacher came over to me and stood over me and said, Ira. Now remember, I'm 4.5 years old. She said, Ira. And I'm sitting there looking, and there's no other kids. I'm playing with the toys, and the other kids are laying down in the other room having cookies and milk. And I don't respond. She says, Ira, standing over me, big adult. She says, Ira. I don't know who she's talking to, and I continue to play, and she's getting irritated. And she taps me on the shoulder, and she says, Ira, I'm talking to you. And I looked at her and said, I don't know who you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. And she says, your name is Ira. And I said, my name is Bobby. She says, no, your name is Ira. And I said, no, my name is Bobby. And she insisted, and it upset me, so I began to cry. And I remember that my mother had to come to school. Right? They had to call my mom from home. She had to come to Dundee School and sit down with me and explain to me that my legal name was Ira. I didn't know until I went to school that my legal name was Ira Robert Wolfson. So it remains an interesting question, is who are you as an adult? So I'm Ira, I'm Robert, I'm Bob, I'm Bobby, I'm Yisrael Meir. I'm many different names, but because my Hebrew, I understood that I had a Hebrew name and that my identity as a Jewish man was not exactly the same as my bobbiness. And so I grew up with this sort of grassroots understanding that school and I were never quite on the same page. I was always a little bit, I was never the smartest kid in school. I was the jokester, the fun maker, I was always a fat kid. I certainly had lots of friends. I mean, I talk to young people today, even my kids, it's very hard for people to remember what a golden period of time the post-World War II era was. I was born in 1952. So by the time I went to school, it was 1957. 1957 in Omaha, Nebraska. I remember vividly that from kindergarten till 5th grade, nobody moved in and nobody moved out. All the kids that I was in school with at Dundee School were the same kids from kindergarten till 5th grade. My children, when they went to kindergarten, half the kids by the end of the school year were different kids. People moved. There was a mobility about society that was different than what we grew up with. I remember the first time in 5th grade a young woman announced that her father was being transferred, and we all thought that the world had come to an end. We couldn't believe it, that somebody was actually moving out of Omaha, Nebraska. How could you possibly move out of Omaha, Nebraska? Who would move? Now, at the same time I say that, we were living in Omaha when SAC Air Command was here, and part of our routine at Dundee School was practicing for a nuclear war. I mean, we all went and stood and walked in the halls and sat and put your heads between your legs and, knew what to do for bomb shelters, and people built bomb shelters. You had friends that were digging their backyards up and building bomb shelters because it was the Cold War. And, there was this sense of doom and a sense of unbridled success all at the same time. Our families, for the most part, my friends and the families that I grew up with, in the 1950s and 60s, if you worked, you were successful. I don't remember anybody feeling unsuccessful. We felt rich, we felt successful, we felt like we were commanders of the world. It was TV and then color TV and jet airplanes, and people began to travel, and people began to buy better clothing and own more things. When I was growing up, things were not an important thing. Early in my life, having things was not an important thing. It was your family, it was food, it was getting together, it was, and then it became traveling to Vegas and being able to go places, and being able to buy better clothing and have more furniture. And I mean, most of my friends had homes, even when they were successful, they had homes, they didn't have furniture. They tell the joke, as somebody said, somebody hired a woman who was doing cleaning for several Jewish families, and the woman asked whether there was something in the Jewish religion that prevented people from having furniture in their living rooms. Because all these Jewish families would buy these houses that were bigger than what they had before. They'd move whatever furniture they had, and they'd spend all their money on the house, and they didn't have furniture. And when they did get furniture, it all had plastic covering. You didn't want to put anything on I bought furniture. Great memories of the great American golden age. This great golden age, and of course the Jewish community. I mean, when I was 9. My brother was 11. My mother decided that she wanted us to still be in Dundee School, but she wanted a better house. And the criterion for the house was not that it just be bigger and better in a better neighborhood. The criterion for the house was to be within walking distance of Bethel Synagogue. She wanted her kids to be able to walk to shul. My mother was, of her 4 sisters, of the 4 girls, my mother was the only one who maintained a kosher home. My mother was the only one who graduated from college. My mother was the one who my grandfather treated like a boy, so she understood business. She was interested in business. She was interested in the news. My folks, until my dad was very, very much older, my folks never belonged to Highland Country Club. A measure of attainment in the Jewish world was belonging to Highland Country Club. My folks never belonged to the Highland Country Club. club. Not that they couldn't afford it, but that was not a priority for them. Of course, remember my mother in the 1950s with Ruth E. Sokoloff started the Nebraska Foundation for the Visually Impaired. My mother always was interested in what we could do in the community, what our responsibilities were for people that were less fortunate. And not that the other girls weren't, but that was a key part of my mom's identity and who she wanted to be. So when I was 9, we moved to a completely different neighborhood to be closer to shul. And the rules were very simple. You were at home having Shabbos dinner. My father, with his brothers-in-law, divided up the responsibilities for covering the closing and opening of the businesses. So you open the grocery store at 7 o'clock in the morning, but remember you close the bar at 1 o'clock in the morning. So somebody had to be there from 7 o'clock in the morning until 1 o'clock in the morning. And they rotated the responsibilities. And my father agreed to always work on Saturday nights, which in Omaha was the social night. The night you went out dancing, you went to the Paxton or you went to the Blackstone Hotel. You went out dancing. And my father loved to dance. My mother and father were gorgeous dancers. But my father agreed to be the one who closed the liquor store every Saturday night at 1 o'clock in the morning because he always wanted Friday nights off. Friday night was the night our family ate dinner together. We either ate at my buddy's house or we ate at our home. And that was part of the rules. And then when we were done eating, we would go out of the house and stand on the corner of 53rd and Dodge and wait for Rabbi Kripke, who was, of course, our idol. He was, and we would walk with Rabbi Kripke from 53rd and Dodge to Bethel Synagogue every Friday night to go to shul, where my mother, eventually my older brother, and I, we believe we're the only family that ever had 3 members of the family in the Bethel choir at the same time. All during high school, the 3 of us sang together with Cantor Edgar at Bethel Synagogue. And Bethel Synagogue was always a very key part of our lives, a key part of our identity, a key part of our lives. I tell people, this is a great story, Rabbi Kripke married my mother and father at Bethel Synagogue. He co-officiated at my brother Ron and his wife's wedding at Beth Israel Synagogue, co-officiated with Isaac Nadoff. He co-officiated at my wedding in Tifereth Israel in Des Moines, Iowa, with Rabbi Chesman, who was the Tifereth Israel guy. And he co-officiated at my younger brother's wedding in New Jersey. So Rabbi Kripke married all 4 of us. And still remains a very important part of our lives at the age of 94. Still a very important part of our family life. Dorothy and Rabbi and my mom were very close, very, very close friends for years and years and years. And when Dorothy died, Rabbi spent most of his holidays at our home, came for Passover and for holidays, and spent time with us. So a very close part of our family. And of course, Rabbi Katz was a huge part of our lives. The synagogue as an institution. Cantor Edgar, Rabbi Kripke, Rabbi Katz, Jack Malad, the whole Bethel Synagogue family was a very key part of our lives. And of course, my mother was an expert at organizing things. You could say to her on a Thursday, I want to have dinner at Bethel Synagogue on Friday night for 50 people, and by Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock, it was taken care of. She could just organize anything. She'd give her a telephone and let her loose, and she could do anything. She just knew how to organize stuff. So, other people, they would talk about having 50 people over for dinner, and it was like a major production. And in our family, 50 people for dinner it's still a major production, but it was not like a thing you had to plan for months in advance. It was something you could do in days. It was something you could just, you just went to the grocery store and you got stuff together. We always had pots and food, and, we could entertain large numbers of people. And to this day, even in New York, I have equipment in my home that is for cooking large amounts of food that I'll never cook. I mean, big pots and big pans and, things for large numbers of people, because cooking for a lot of people food was a key part of our family life. Obviously, it's part of why I was fat all my life. It was Food was a way you expressed love, it's a way you expressed family, it's the way you celebrated. It was a key part of our family life.
Bob, then later, where did you go to high school?
My high school story is a little bit of a checkered story. I went to high school at Central High. Remember that I went to Central in 1968, and that was an interesting problem. 2 or 3 things happened. Number one, my older brother Ron, who was 3 years older than me, was big man on campus in Central. He was part of the group they called the Bunch. The Bunch, I mean, you can look back at Central High School's history, and this was an extraordinary group of young men, all Jewish, who just took control. They were USY, they were Bethel Synagogue, they were Central High School, and each of them is more successful than the next. I mean, they're all at the tops of their fields. Ronnie, Milt Ehrman, Johnny Whitman, Richard Green. These guys are just a story to be told, quite an extraordinary story. And my brother was in all the plays, he was the head of the French club, he was the student body president, he was in USY, he was everything. Ronnie was a big feature of our lives. And I got to Central, and I was a little more interested in the darker things in life. I liked knowing who was plotting against the administration. I liked knowing what was happening on the streets of Omaha. I liked knowing what politics were happening. I was not the same person as my brother. And Ronnie had graduated and gone to Washington University. And I showed up at Central High School. The first thing that happened is everybody started calling me Ronnie. So the very first thing that happened is all the teachers expected the same thing out of me that they expected out of Ronnie, and I resented the hell out of it. I didn't like it at all. My second semester of my sophomore year, that would be my first year at Central, because we went to Lewis and Clark Junior High for 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, and then we went to Central. My first success at Central was I was a very oral person. You can tell I liked speaking, and I was very interested in debate. And so I competed for and was one of a group of people that was successful at beginning my varsity debate career at Central High School in my second semester of my sophomore year. It was very unusual. Central was a storied debate team, award-winning, very successful debate team. The man who was the coach of the debate squad was a Jewish guy, Weinstein. 90% of the people on the debate squad were Jewish kids. And I was successful at getting on the debate squad. This was also the year George Wallace was running for President of the United States, and it was the year that Central High School had a very famous basketball team that was very successful. The center of the basketball team in 1968 was a fellow named Dwayne Dillard. Dwayne was 6'7", huge, athletic black kid. And when George Wallace came to town, you may remember that night, North Omaha exploded in riots. Dwayne Dillard was arrested. This varsity basketball player, Central, had riots for days. There was burning Jewish and other businesses in North Omaha, completely destroyed the sense of community in North Omaha that had existed before then. It was a very, very bad scene in Omaha. A Jewish kid at Central High School was stabbed as a result of some racial tension. And I had a fight with my debate coach. Arnold Weinstein was his name. We nicknamed him the Worm. And Arnold was a bad teacher. And of course, I was young and I didn't know any better. I suppose we were hard. But in the debate squad, you either you were good at performing or you were not. There wasn't any debate about whether you were a good student or not a good student. And for the midterm exams, Arnie decided that he was going to actually give midterm exams, which for a varsity debate squad was unheard of. This is the third semester of my sophomore year. And we walked into the room and Arnie said, today is the day of your midterm exam, take out a piece of paper and pencil, and here's the exam. And during the exam, one of the young women who was my age, very successful lawyer, gone on for a sort of stellar career, stood up in the middle of the exam, walked over to the then captain of the senior debate squad, and openly in front of the teacher asked the answer for number 5. And the guy gave her the answer to number 5. Openly. Cheated. So another guy and I looked at each other. He was also a senior. We looked at each other and just got hysterical. We thought it was the funniest thing we had ever seen in our lives. We just thought that was just about as funny as you get. And Arnie Weintraub did not take to, Weinstein, Arnie did not take to that very kindly. He thought we were disrespectful. Now, he didn't say it was odd that he was letting somebody openly cheat, but he didn't like the disrespect of us disrupting his midterm exam. So it turned out that the guy that had laughed with me and I had the same academic counselor, and we were next morning sent to our academic counselor for counsel on our disruption of the midterm exam. And the counselor had us both in the room and said, you two disrupted an examination yesterday. We both looked at each other and got hysterical. We thought that was even funnier, that this guy, this teacher, who had watched this cheating, had the nerve to have us be punished for disrupting the exam. We were hysterical. Oh, the counselor just went crazy and suspended us from school, kicked us out of school, and informed us that the only way we could come back to school was if we brought our parents to meet with the vice principal, who was then Dr. Moeller. Dr. Moeller was the assistant vice president of discipline at the time, became the principal later. So we met with our parents that evening, and the guy who was the one with me had already been accepted to the University of California at Berkeley and was afraid that he was going to they were going to withdraw his acceptance from going to Berkeley. And so we decided to go into the school the next morning and apologize, and say we're sorry. So we apologized and we were let back into school. But my mother used the occasion, because there were these race riots going on, to have a conversation with Dr. Moeller, who was the assistant principal. And she said, Dr. Moeller, explain to me why my son is struggling in your school. I was getting 3s and 4s. I was not successful. I was a troublemaker. I was involved with all the black kids and knew all the things that were happening that were bad in the school. Knew about the conflicts between the jarheads that were going to become Marine Corps. And I was actually in ROTC for a Jewish kid. That was very unusual. I had gone to a military academy, and so I was kind of identified with that. I was in ROTC, and I was a troublemaker in ROTC. They just didn't know quite what to do with me. I was not a linear kid. Never been much of a linear person. So she said to Dr. Moeller, explain to me my son. He said, what do you mean? She said, well, on all the standardized tests, my son scores at the top. He's a terrific student. But academically, he's not doing well. So how can you explain what's happening to my son? I'm worried that he's under the shadow of his brother and his success, and he's not being successful. And Dr. Moeller looked at my papers and he said, Mrs. Wolfson, your son is not college material. And if I were giving you advice, I would say that we should send your son to body shop and woodworking and to learn how to make a trade, because he's not going to be able to make a living in being college bound. It's a waste of your time. And my mother's answer was, can I get a copy of my son's academic papers? And he said, of course. And he made a copy, and she said, thank you very much. And she got in a car with a stack of papers from my file, and she drove to Westside High School. And she met with Von Phelps. And she handed him my file, and she said to Von Phelps, "What would you do with my son if I decided to pay tuition for my son to come to Westside High School?" And he looked at the papers, and he said to my mother, "Clearly, your son is intelligent, and clearly, he is not being challenged. And if your son were to come to Westside High School, I would put him in every advanced placement course I could put him in. And I would challenge him and see if he could match up to the expectations." And the next day, my parents sat me down and said, "How would you feel about going to Westside School the next year?" And I said, "Fine." And my junior and senior year, I went to Westside High School, and I got mostly straight A's, and was very successful, and went on to Washington University and had a very successful career, which, had I not transferred to Westside, I probably would have been fixing cars today, which I thank my mother for. College is a little bit complicated. I'm going to tell you a story a little later, and then I'll backtrack. In my family, on your prenuptial dinner before you're married, the cousins get together and sing a song that makes fun of you. They roast you in front of all your family and friends gathered. And the night that they roasted me for my wedding 33 years ago, they sang the following song. And by the way, the number that they sang is accurate, so I'll show you the number. Bobby Wolfson went to college, 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 I knew. And they sang a song about how funny it was that I went to all these colleges. I went to 5 colleges before I graduated from college. Again, I was not a linear kid. I was difficult. My mother believed that I was falling into the drug culture of the late 1960s, not without reason. And she thought she was losing me. And my mother was fairly controlling about the nature of what she accepted. So after I graduated from high school, before I went to college, by the way, I applied for only one college, which is where Ronnie was. Ronnie was at Washington University. I only applied to one college. I got into Washington University. Probably didn't have sufficient grades to get into Washington University, but at that time you had a legacy if you had a family member who went there or had gone there. So I got legacy points and probably got in for that reason. I went to work at Esther K. Newman Camp for Sherman Posca the summer between high school and college. I was very active in USY. I loved kids. I didn't want to be at home. And one of the things I did over the summer is I grew a beard. Now, I've had a beard pretty much since then, with the exception of maybe 3 years. Virtually my entire adult life, I've had a beard. So it wasn't like I was going to grow this for fashion. I mean, it wasn't like I was in a phase. But for my mother, the beard represented the loss of her son, her son's innocence. So my mother and I, the senior year of high school and my summer between high school and college, to say that we butted heads would not accurately describe it. We had a very difficult time. My father was a little bit more on the wisdom side of the coin, saying, you know, you've given your son everything he needs, let him go find his own way. My mother was a little more on the you'll do what I tell you kind of person. And I didn't do well with I'm going to tell you what to do. My older brother and my younger brother were a little more compliant than I was. I was a little more of a resistant kid. I was not a get along, go along kind of kid. My mother would say to me, you have to respect me. And I would say, well, if you earn my respect, I'll give it. My mother would say, you owe me respect because I'm your mother. And I would say, I owe you respect because of the way you treat me. And we would just go round and round and round like cats and dogs. very difficult conversations. My father was the buffer between the two of us. So I went away for the summer and came back with a beard. And when I went to college, to Washington University, my brother and met me at the bus. I went. My mother had refused to kiss me goodbye, had withheld her love because she thought I was going down the wrong path. And I lasted at Washington University for 1 week. And much more complicated story, not worth going into today, but the net result of the story is I understood somehow. I wasn't the most self-aware person at the time. Self-awareness is something that is an interesting problem for us as moderns. I like to tell people, if you ask my Zadie, were you happy or are you happy? He would hit you upside the head and say to you, you know, you got a job, you got family, was ist das happy? You know, happiness was not the measure of a person's successful life. And so I have this sense of being in two worlds at the same time. I didn't come to life thinking that I had to be happy, but I also understood somehow that knowing what you were about as a person was an important thing in the milieu that I was growing up in. So here I am, 1970. I had been to Israel and to Eastern Europe with USY. I traveled the world already as a young man, much more worldly than my family was, certainly my mother and father. I loved Israel when I went there. I was not really ready to go to college, and I had this terrible conflict with my mother. So I went into, after a week of college, I went into my dean of my college, and I said, look, I don't feel like I belong here right now. So I want to know, if I leave, can I come back a year from now? And he said yes. So I called my parents and I said, I'm coming home. 7 days after I got to college. Came home and my parents said to me, you can't be out of college. We can't allow it. And I said, Mom, Dad, I don't want to be in college. It's not the right thing. I need to settle my problems with my mom, and I need to know where I am in life. I don't need to be in college. They refused to accept that. So they insisted that I enroll at Creighton University. And I went down to Creighton University and we paid tuition and I enrolled. Unhappily, I was not happy about being in college. I saw a psychiatrist about my conflicts with my mother and father, and went to college at Creighton University. My first class at Creighton University was done by a member of the Society of Jesus, a priest. And the first day of the first class, he insisted that everybody genuflex. And I stood up and said, you don't understand, I'm a Jewish guy. I ain't doing that. And he said, you're in my class, you're doing it. I said, sorry, ain't gonna work that way. So again, in a pattern that repeated itself many times, a teacher and I did not see eye to eye, and it had a major impact. It was a huge conflict. The net result of my spending time with a psychiatrist was that my life, for all sorts of sensible reasons, was intertwined so deeply with my family, and particularly with my mother, that I was going to have some difficulty becoming an independent person. That was going to be hard for me. And I made the decision, against my parents' will, that I was going to spend a year in Israel. And I came home from a visit with the psychiatrist who supported the idea. And I said to my mom and dad, I'm going to buy a ticket and I'm going to go to Israel. I'm going to spend a year in Israel. And I'm going to come back and go to college. And they said, no, you're not. You're not going to do that. So you're going to stay at Creighton University. I said, this guy genuflects all these problems, Christian University, I'm not saying. And I had, like most Jewish kids of that time, I had a few $1,000s saved up from my bar mitzvah and from working, and of course my parents had access to the money and I didn't. But I did own a passport. I had a passport. So my parent said, you're not going, we're not going to let you go. And I said, in my family, a relatively emotional couple of days, I said to him, look, I have friends in Kansas City. I got a job at the kosher butcher store in Kansas City waiting for me. I'm going to pack up a backpack with my passport. I'm going to go down to Kansas City. I'm going to earn enough money for a one-way ticket to Israel. And I'm going to Israel, whether you like it or you don't. It's not your choice. Your only choice is whether you give me access to the money that I had for my bar mitzvah to buy the ticket or not. That's your only choice. And your only choice is whether I walk out of the house and move to Kansas City and have to work for it, or you let me go with your blessing. That's your choice. My parents had a very upsetting night. The next morning, my parents had me come into their bedroom. I sat on the bed and I said, before I hear your decision, I want to tell you a story. It's actually a story from a Herman Hesse novel, Siddhartha. Siddhartha was a young man who was sitting in his father's home when a group of ascetics, people that denied themselves physical and worldly pleasures, these ascetics had come by, and Siddhartha had been very attracted to them as a way of life, as a way of exploring his spirituality in India. And his father refused. He said to Siddhartha, I forbid you to join these people. You cannot go. And Siddhartha goes into his family's living room and goes into a full lotus position and goes into a trance. Refuses all water and food, doesn't communicate with anyone, and for days he sits in this trance. And the father realizes that while he's physically still present, his son has gone. He's left his family home. And in a famous Herman Hesse line, which has always had great meaning for me, which I repeated to my parents at the time, Siddhartha's father comes and says to him, my son, I realize that you've already left my home. Follow these men, and if you find enlightenment, come back and teach it to me. If you find disillusionment, come back and we'll pray together by the river. And I told that to my parents. And they informed me that they had agreed to let me have the money. And eventually, with Rabbi Kripke's help, I found a place to go study Hebrew. And I moved to an Orthodox kibbutz in Israel for a year, where I learned Hebrew and spent time physically working, which was terrific for me. Physically, it was with other students from around the world, and I lived in Israel for a year and had a wonderful experience. And came back primarily because I was the first year of the draft of the lottery. If I was picked a low number, under 100, I would have had to go to Vietnam, and I wasn't going to serve in Vietnam. I did not believe in Vietnam. I wasn't a pacifist, but had I gotten a number that was low, I was going to stay in college, and I had to be in college when the lottery actually occurred. So I returned to the United States, went to summer school at Washington University. My freshman year was the summer before my freshman year. Was living in St. Louis and in college, and my number was picked. I was 325. So I could stay in college and not go to Vietnam, which I would not have done. My college career, so I was at Washington University for a week. I was at Creighton University. My first year of school, I actually taught Hebrew school with my brother, Ronnie, in his Vav class program at B'nai Emunah Synagogue. A great story of really important context. When I was in Israel, I became a religious vegetarian. I was exposed to the idea that in Jewish tradition, it's only after Noah that the introduction of eating meat is introduced in the 5 books of Moses. So the idyllic life of Gan Eden, the idyllic life of the perfect Garden of Eden, was eating the fruits and vegetables, eating the produce of the land. And I had become religiously a vegetarian in Israel. But for me, it had greater meaning than just being a vegetarian. I refused to use leather products. I wouldn't wear shoes. I wouldn't wear belts. I wouldn't drive in a car with leather. I used no leather in my life, which was a little bit of an extreme view, but I didn't use leather. So when I came that summer, my brother had this successful program that he was teaching at this synagogue, a very experimental program that was a key part of his early career. He was working on his PhD at the time in education. And it had grown, and they needed another teacher to teach in this class, and they hired me to be the second teacher in this 12-class program at B'nai Emunah Synagogue in St. Louis during my freshman year in college. To say that I was unusual as a choice was probably a nice way of putting it. I was wearing overalls and no leather. I would not eat meat. I liked people who kept kosher because I thought it was religiously important, but I did not keep kosher. I ate nothing but vegetables. And more importantly, religiously, I refused to wear tefillin. Even though I had worn tefillin earlier in my life, I refused to wear tefillin because it's made out of leather. So I met with Rabbi Bernie Lipnick, who was the senior rabbi. Rabbi Lipnick had taken a year off of his sabbatical and written his own PhD thesis by observing Ronnie's first class. The second class, Ronnie wrote his own PhD thesis observing his own classroom, and then I was the second class. So Rabbi Lipnick and I had a long conversation about this issue, and he understood that I was not going to use tefillin. But he also asked me if I could teach the kids how to lane tefillin. And I agreed that I would teach them. I wouldn't use it myself, but I would teach the kids how to lane tefillin. So it was a successful year. I won't go into the details of the year, but comes time in the year, and we took kids away for a weekend camping experience every month. Once a month we would go camping somewhere and gave them Shabbos, because many of them didn't have Shabbos experiences in their own homes. We'd sing Zmiras and teach them what it was like to have Shabbos and teach them how to rest. All of these things, great stuff. And came time for me to teach the kids how to put on tefillin. And the shamus, the guy who is the volunteer of the daily minyan at B'nai Emunah, happened to be a very wealthy man of great importance in the synagogue life. Himself an immigrant, very religious, in a conservative synagogue. And I had my kids around me, and I was teaching them all how to wear tefillin and how to use a tallis. And I'm wearing a tallis, but I'm not putting on tefillin. So this guy comes over to me, and he's wearing tefillin. He comes over to me and he says, "Mr. Wolfson, where's your tefillin?" And I say to him, "Sir, with all due respect, I'm teaching the children how to wear tefillin. They're all post-bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, and I'm teaching them how to do it, but actually for religious reasons, I don't believe in wearing tefillin." Oh my God, you would have thought I shot him with a shotgun. He storms out of the synagogue, and that's the last I hear of it. I go on to teach the rest of the year. My career in college is, I go to University of Nebraska at Lincoln for a semester because my parents didn't like my lifestyle, and I said, if you don't want to pay for my lifestyle, I'll move to Nebraska. I'll pay my own way. I went to work at a grocery store and a liquor store. I worked 48 hours a week. I took 15 hours of credit. I lived independently of my parents' money, and after half a semester of that, I came back to my parents and said, just tell me what the rules are. I want to go back to a good college. So I went back to Washington University. I eventually ended up in the joint program with the Theological Seminary, the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York and Columbia University, and graduated with a degree in social work from Columbia University eventually. It's the end of the story. 10 years later, I'm at a wedding, and Bernie Lipnick, the rabbi, is sitting at the dinner table with me. And he leans over to me and he says, "I want to tell you a story." I said, "Sure." He says, "Do you remember the Sunday that you had this wealthy member of our congregation confronted you about your crazy idea that you wouldn't wear tefillin?" I said, "Yes, I remember it very well." He said, "Do you know what happened then?" I said, "No, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened then." He says, "Well, let me tell you a story." He said, "I was meeting with a congregant when that man burst through my door interrupting my meeting with the congregant in a tefillin and wearing his talis, and kicked the other person out and said, "I'm the largest contributor to this synagogue. I get more money than anybody else. And you go in there and you get that Wolfson guy who says he refuses to wear tefillin for religious reasons, and you fire him right now. And if you don't fire him, I quit. I'm quitting your synagogue." And Rabbi Lipnick, 10 years later, is telling me this story, says to him, "I think Wolfson is crazy. He has a very strange idea about Jewish tradition. But it's a thoughtful idea. And while I disagree with him, he told me about it, I knew about it, and I would hate to lose you as a congregant, but if that's your position." And the guy quit. Bernie Lipnick, without telling me, never making an issue of it, never talking to me, waited 10 years to tell me that he lost the largest contributor to his synagogue for defending my right to not wear tefillin. An amazing story, an amazing story. Still one of my huge mentors, a huge man of great substance. To this day, still living. A great guy, a great story. But I eventually ended up in New York. I had had a camping experience. I was the director of male staff for a Easter Seal Society camp in Nebraska, where I was the only Jewish guy, and everybody who worked for me was a fundamentalist Christian. And I was a relatively educated Jewish guy. I carried around with me a Tanakh and a Hebrew English dictionary, and I studied, and I was interested in Jewish life. And I remember having a conversation with a young woman who said to me, in discussing whether or not the 5 books of Moses predicted the virgin birth of Virgin Mary. The word actually in the 5 books of Moses is Betula, young maiden. And whether or not that was used by the Christian community to predict or to explain the virgin birth. We were having this conversation when she, crying, said to me, "You don't understand. What the words say don't matter." And I said to myself, wow, this is really important for me to understand, that I need to understand Christianity and Judaism better, because you can't argue with someone who says, "You don't understand, what you're saying rationally doesn't matter to me. This is for me a matter of faith." And it just blew me away. And I actually applied for and went to the joint program with the Jewish Theological Seminary because I wanted to learn more about my Jewish tradition. So I ended up in New York.
When did you end up in law school?
Well, it's an interesting story. When I was at the joint program in New York, I was in an experimental program with a guy from the School of Social Work at Columbia University. You may know it's one of the world-famous schools of social work. It's a very, very famous school. A guy named Charlie Grosser started an experiment where if you joined his thing and you were successful in his program, your 2 years of social work school, which was your junior and senior year of college, if you applied, could be used as your first year of your master's in social work degree. And then you just went on to another year of social work, and you could get your MSW in an advanced year, which was pretty cool because normally social work schools take 2 years. So I was in the first class of this experimental program, and I applied for and was accepted to the MSW program at Columbia University. And in my senior year of college, my father had an almost fatal heart attack. And my parents had an active business life. They had Dippy Donuts, they had the deli, and my older brother, Ron, had just started his PhD program at Washington University. And my younger brother, Doug, had just gone away to college for the first time. It was his freshman year of college. And I was about to graduate from college, so it made the most sense for me to be the one who returned to help my parents through this illness. So I did not go to the MSW program at Columbia University. I left college, I moved out of New York. I came back to Omaha, and I worked in my family business. It did not take me long to understand that that was not going to be sufficient for me. I loved the business. I loved working with my mom and in my family business, but I knew that wasn't going to be sufficient for me. And so I applied for law school at Creighton University and met my wife, my future wife, the same time I came back to Omaha. I came back in July, met her right away. We got engaged in January of '76 and married in April of '76, and I started law school in August of '76. And so I knew that I wanted to be something more than just having a bachelor's degree and being a donut maker and working in the business. But I didn't really know what I wanted to be, so that's what happened. I want to first thank Ben Nachman. Life gets very busy, and we do a lot of things, and having an opportunity to talk and tell stories and to think about your family and to pause for a moment and preserve it in a video is a very powerful thing, so I want to thank you, Ben. But I also want to think about what it is we're doing here, which is to make a gift to our family. I come from an amazing family, and I could name everyone. I'm not going to name everyone. To everyone who will see this, all of our children, hopefully someday our grandchildren, our living relatives, my brothers, their wives, their children, our friends. This is a gift to preserve these stories, to have an opportunity to, through our storytelling, tell you how much you mean to me, how much the meaning of my life is enhanced by all of your being in it, how loving I feel about our family and how loved I feel by our family. We do like to say in our family that we don't miss an opportunity to say that. I kiss my father, I kiss my brothers, I kiss my relatives every chance I get. We are a demonstrative family who tells each other that we love each other, and I will not get hit by a bus and feel that I have not said what I need to say in my life. My children know, my wife knows, all of you know how much I care about you and how deeply I love you. But this is an opportunity in a different way, in a different moment, in a different mode, to tell you how much you mean to me, how much I love you, and how much I hope these words enhance your life, enhance the understanding you have of who I am and where I come from, and what an incredible journey it's been, what an incredible life it's been so far. Many, many more chapters to be written, but the love of my life has been enhanced by all of you. And I appreciate it very much.